The best chess player in the world, Magnus Carlsen, almost never loses, winning almost every tournament he's ever taken part in. But these are rare instances where deadly players you wouldn't expect have demolished Magnus in a matter of seconds. Starting with this game, Magnus played against Alexander Morozevich, who was ranked number 2 in the world at his peak. Magnus's opponent was not just anybody, and when the clock turned on, Magnus started the game by moving his pawn to c4, which Alexander responds to by moving his pawn to e6, and after the first few moves are played, the game turns into an English opening, with white's pawns on c4 and e3 and black's pawns on t5 and f6. Morozevich captures Magnus's pawn on c4, after which Magnus quickly moves his bishop to g2 before castling his king to safety. In this position, Magnus Carlsen has already castled, while none of Morozevich's pieces are developed. Morozevich, though, has an extra pawn, and knowing match, plays his pawn to b5, defending his weak extra pawn on c4. After a few seconds of thinking, Magnus plays his pawn to a4, attacking black's middle pawns. Because Magnus has the light pieces, he really needs to win this game. And after Morozevich moves his bishop to the diagonal, a set of pawns are traded off, after which Magnus also puts his bishop on the diagonal. Interestingly enough, Morozevich seems to have a slight advantage here, and Magnus doesn't seem to be content with his position. But this would soon change, as over the next few moves, Magnus starts creating a bit of an attack on Morozevich's king, trading his rook for a knight, before trading down pawns, revealing a triple attack on Alexander's pawn on f7. Alexander immediately defends this foe with his queen, which, after a few moments of thinking from Magnus, plays the move knight g4. Magnus is pairing an extremely dangerous attack, and Morozevich must defend this perfectly if he wants to win. After Morozevich moves his bishop, Magnus plays knight f6, forcing a trade of all the pieces. And while Magnus wants to bring his queen in to infiltrate Morozevich's position, it is too late. Morozevich already has too much extra material and only needs trade pieces off to win the game. Before a few moves later, Morozevich forces another trade with bishop d5, pinning Magnus's bishop to his king. And after a long sequence of juggling around pieces, Morozevich hides his king in a corner while threatening checkmate from taking the pawn on h4. Magnus here, hence, no option but to resign. But this next match is much more interesting, because in this game against Borisenko, Magnus would play one of the worst mistakes in chess history. Magnus Carlsen moves his pawn to e4, which Boris responds to with c5, and after the first few moves are played, the game turns into a Sicilian defense, with white's pawns on c4 and e4, and black's pawns on c6 and f6. Magnus places bishop to e2, after which both players castle into a completely equal position. It is in this stage of the game where Magnus will try creating an advantage against Boris, and after Boris develops his bishop, Magnus begins to create a nightmare for Boris, playing his bishop to e3 with an idea to start an attack after pushing his pawn to f4. But this doesn't scare Boris, as he immediately plays his queen to a5, connecting his rooks on the back rank. Magnus moves his rook to the side, and Boris, after a quick thought, moves his rook towards a more active square. Both players have no idea that they will soon be stepping into a bloodbath. Magnus starts a quick attack with his pawn, making Boris retreat his knight to safety. And it is at this moment, unfortunately, Magnus makes a scary blunder. After thinking for some time, Magnus moves his knight to d5, which gives away a free pawn on a2. Boris notices this and takes the pawn with his queen, after which Magnus pushes his pawn, seemingly having a plan here. And after a few more moves, Boris plays knight at 6, a blunder, allowing Magnus to play knight c3, which after Boris moves, Magnus will be able to play his pawn to b5, winning a knight. The Doris knows. He's Mazda and gives away his knight, allowing him to play on. Magnus is in control now, and after some piece shuffling, the bishops are traded off, and Magnus offers a queen trade, which Boris should not accept, as playing an endgame against Magnus is extremely difficult. Unfortunately, Boris has no choice but to take the pawn, allowing Magnus to trade queens and move his bishop to b6. Magnus knows he has this game in the bag, as Boris is nowhere near as good at endgames as him. Boris plays his pawn to f5, after which Magnus brings his king closer. A set of pawns are traded, another mistake from Boris, as this move only helps Magnus get closer to a win. Magnus pushes his pawn to h3, with Boris moving his king closer and Magnus moving his rook up, trying to stack rooks. And while the position looks safe for Magnus, Boris still has a lot of threats in the air, with him playing his rook to b3, which, well, looks like it's giving Magnus a free rook after trading on b3. It allows Boris to get a pawn, which will promote to a queen. Magnus can't accept this, moving his rook to d1, getting Boris a free pawn. Both players now have an equal position, and Magnus offers a bishop trade, which Boris declines, attacking Magnus's knight. Magnus moves his bishop back, which Boris attacks, and after a little annoyance, moves away. And while Magnus is great in these positions, the clock is getting low and the pressure is starting to build. Boris attacks Magnus's bishop again, threatening to win it before Magnus checks Boris's king, forcing a rook trade, after which, while a few more moves are played before Boris pushes his pawn to c3, only 2 squares away from becoming a queen. Magnus blocks this, after which Boris defends his pawn with his bishop. Now Magnus has a slightly better position here, but only if he plays perfectly. A set of moves are played before Magnus grabs the pawn, after which the bishop and rook are traded off. Magnus has a rook and 2 pawns, while Boris has a bishop and 4 pawns, but a passed pawn, which is very strong. The position will still likely end in a draw, though, unless Magnus or Boris happen to blunder. The two shuffle their pieces around until Magnus moves his king to d3, looking to defend his pawns from Boris's king. Little does he know, this move will lead to his worst blunder, which after Boris moves his bishop back to e1, Magnus plays by moving his king to d4, which completely blunders the game. This move allows Boris to move his bishop to check the king, which after Magnus moves, will win a free rook. Because of this, after moving his king, Magnus, after taking his hand off, instantly moves it again to a better square. Unfortunately for Magnus, this is an illegal move, and Boris immediately points it out, making Magnus scrunch up his face before stopping the clock, signifying the game is over. And while this loss was taken from an illegal move, the next match was even more devastating, as in this casual game against Judith Polgar, Magnus was about to meet his match. Judith opened the game with e4, which Magnus responds to with c4, the Sicilian defense. After the first few pieces are developed, Judith castles her king queenside, and after the knights are traded off, Magnus puts his bishop on b7, making Judith kick away Magnus's knight. But Magnus has a smart tactic here, taking Judith's pawn on g4, which cannot be recaptured, as then her rook can be taken. Judith doesn't know what to do, but then kicks away Magnus's knight with her rook. A few more moves are played, and after Judith moves her bishop to e4, Magnus plays his rook to c8. A terrible blunder. And Judith sees why immediately, playing her bishop to b6. If Magnus takes the bishop, Judith will checkmate him on d7. Magnus thinks for a long time before taking Judith's bishop, but he has already lost. And after losing his queen and bringing his knight in, Magnus resigns the game, losing in only. But this next game is even more insane, as his next opponent wasn't even a chess professional. This is a chess player who challenged Magnus in a bar in Norway. Little does he know, he will be playing one of the most surprising games in chess history. Carlsen, with the white pieces, started with an instant e4, with which his opponent responded with d5. The game quickly goes into the standard Roy Lopez opening, with the knights connected and c3 being played. Magnus's opponent then played his pawn to e6, chasing Magnus's bishop away. Well, at the start of this match, all the moves are played well. The first mistake of the game was made with knight g6, which allows Magnus to take full control of the center after knight c3. A quick look at their body language would also show Magnus was extremely confident in his moves, while his opponent, who we'll call A, seems to think and consider the moves beforehand. This will play a major role in the outcome of the match, as you'll see in a few moves. In this stage of the match, Magnus has a slight advantage from his well-placed pawns in the center and is already preparing for an attack after bishop c2, having an aim at A's knight. In this position, Magnus's pieces are already a lot more active, and things are not looking good for A. Magnus has built up a huge attack on the king's side, already being able to trap A's bishop. If he continues playing like this, he will win very quickly. It's at this moment A realizes he's messed up. Magnus attacked his knight, forcing him to move, but after moving his knight, Magnus could trap his bishop with his pawn attack, making him lose a piece. A takes some time before realizing there's nothing he can do, and surrenders his bishop by capturing the pawn. But even though things don't look good for A, Magnus plays that sits, an inaccuracy, while something like queen g3 would have been better. A plays queen e5, threatening a scary mate on the h2 square. Magnus defends this by playing bishop f4. A immediately finds an attacking move with queen h5, which unfortunately is another mistake as it doesn't threaten mate. Magnus realizes this, taking the pawn with g7 immediately. A is in trouble again. A's body language shows he knows things are getting bad, but he still goes on by moving his rook away from danger. Under pressure, A is doing everything to hold on, and at this moment, a miracle happens. Carlsen plays a terrible move, knight f5. Allowing A to win a free pawn while attacking the queen under high pressure. Carlsen automatically tries taking the knight before realizing he's fallen into a terrible mistake. Upon trying to play for a fancy queen fork, he had accidentally blundered his queen. Similar to how Max had done against him in a previous challenge, Magnus Carlsen immediately resigned after this move, looking very visibly unhappy. His quick moves and confidence throughout the match had made him slip up and capture a piece by impulse. But it's okay to lose, Magnus. After all, you're still our world champion.